Welcome to the Clothed in Glory campaign, where we hold gender justice conversations. This is one of 7 episodes that are available on YouTube. You can find the rest of the videos in our playlist under Clothed in Glory.
So excited to present to you our 2 speakers who will be speaking to us at that intersection of fashion, of faith, of queer theology, LGBTQ inclusion and rights. So one of them is Reverend Jonah Overton, they, them pronouns. They're a community organizer, creator of these 2 podcasts that we'll be sending in a follow-up email, so you can be sure to give them a listen, Jonah and the Peacock and Christian Queeries. And they're the lead pastor of SojoAction, a church in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And as a young queer and trans clergy person, Jonah has been called into ministry to build the church as a queer space and organize communities and churches toward justice and liberation. And Jonah is joined by their spouse, Pastor Cameron Overton, he, him pronouns, and he's a social worker, professor, and the executive pastor at SojoAction Church. Cameron has a Master of Social Work from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee and is currently pursuing his doctorate at the University of St. Thomas. And as a young Black, queer, and trans person, Cameron's ministry calling is to build the church into an intersectional, queer, and liberated space.
Hello, thank you so much, Paula. It's so good to be here with all of you. As Paula mentioned, my name is Jonah. My pronouns are they, them, theirs, and I'm a church planter, which means that my call is to build community from scratch. And I came to Milwaukee, with the support of my denomination and the goal to build a church that didn't exist yet. One of the central questions at the heart of SojoAction Church is, what does the church look like if it is run by, led by, visioned by people who have been excluded historically from church space and leadership? And so I'm really excited to co-pastor with the love of my life, Cameron Overton, and for us as queer and trans people to lead a community that is queer and trans disproportionately in its membership. We have majority queer and trans POC young folks. We have all kinds of different experiences represented in our leadership team in particular, and so our church looks a little different because it's run by folks who have not always had space to leave their imprint on the shape of the church. That's me, and I'll just say that our core values, what that looks like. I keep saying it looks different, but for us, what that looks like is being Jesus-rooted, justice-centered, and radically inclusive. And I don't know, Cameron will probably go in a little bit more in detail into what that means.
Yeah, so good to be with you all. My name's Cameron. I use he, him, his pronouns. And I am a Black, queer, and trans person, a person who grew up in church in really, more conservative, evangelical spaces, and could never really find my voice or my place in that space. And it took me many, many years to become exactly who I am today, which is such a liberating experience to be able to be and live authentically who I am. And so part of that authenticity is my love of Jesus and my love of telling others about that as well. And so being able to be at SoJo, where we live in that Jesus-rooted, justice-centered, radically inclusive way, it's the first place where we get to actually vision what I believe the church should and can be. And so, yeah, I'll go through, for me, Jesus rooted is a Jesus that's a brown skinned revolutionary who stood up to power and went to the margins where people were excluded and created community that said, hey, we have a different way. And so when we do that, we see how Jesus led that marginalized people into the places of power and stood up to them and said, like, hey, if we are to do this new thing, we have to be justice centered. So at SoJo, we do the same. You've heard how we've kind of collected our people, but we are exclusively saying, we are in the streets, we are marching for Black lives, we are saying no person is illegal, and we are doing the things that most people say, oh, I'll send my prayers that way, but we're using our feet, hands, hearts, and all the pieces of us to actually live into that. And so what that does is make us very radically inclusive. But I love who, I think it was you, Paula, who already kind of said it, where some of the ideas around what inclusion means is like all are welcome. And that is true at ZOW. And that radical piece means that we actually hold up the voices of the most marginalized first. And so I think that's how we make all of our decisions. That's how we, we do everything that we do at ZOW, and I believe that makes it radical. So yeah, that's me, that's ZOW, that's the things that I care deeply about and do every day.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction and for being here on this call and sharing some of your journey to creating this church that I am really tempted to be moving to Milwaukee to be able to attend. But if you can't do that, I put a link and we'll have links to their podcast as well. Now I wanted to talk about a Bible verse, and I know we talked about it when we connected before, and I know that it's part of the inspiration for the podcast that I mentioned, Jonah and the Peacock, and it's Genesis 37. So it's a whole chapter. Stick with me, and then we'll talk a little bit more about why that's been so meaningful to you both. This is Jonah 37. Jacob settled in the land where his father had lived as an alien, the land of Canaan. These are the descendants of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was shepherding the flock with his brothers. He was a helper to the sons of Bilhah and Silpah, his father's wives, and Joseph brought a bad report of them to their father. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other children because he was the son of his old age, and he made him an ornamented robe. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peaceably to him. Once Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream that I dreamed. There we were, biting sheaves in the field. Suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright. Then your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf." His brothers said to him, "Are you indeed to reign over us? Are you indeed to have dominion over us?" So they hated him even more because of his dreams and his words. He had another dream and told it to his brothers, saying, "Look, I have had another dream. The sun, the moon, and the 11 stars were bowing down to me." But when he told it to his father and to his brothers, his father rebuked him and said to him, "What kind of dream is this that you have had? Shall we indeed come, I and your mother and your brothers, and bow to the ground before you?" So his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. Now his brothers went to pasture their father's flock near Shechem, and Israel said to Joseph, "Are not your brothers pasturing the flock of Shechem? Come, I will send you to them." He answered, "Here I am." So he said to him, "Go now, see if it is well with your brothers and with the flock, and bring word back to me." So he sent him from the valley of Hebron. He came to Shechem, and a man found him wandering in the fields. The man asked him, "What are you seeking?" "I am seeking my brothers," he said. "Tell me, please, where are they pasturing the flock?" The man said, "They have gone away, for I heard them say, 'Let us go to Dothan.'" So Joseph went after his brothers and found them at Dothan. They saw him from a distance, and before he came near to them, they conspired to kill him. They said to one another, "Here comes this dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we shall say that a wild animal has devoured him, and we shall see what will become of his dreams." But when Reuben heard it, he delivered him out of their hands, saying, "Let us not take his life." Reuben said to them, "Shed no blood, throw him in the pit here in the wilderness, but lay no hand on him, that he might rescue him out of their hands and restore him to his father." So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the ornamented robe that he wore, and they took him and threw him into a pit. The pit was empty, there was no water in it. They sat down to eat. Looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead, with their camels carrying gum, balm, and resin, on their way to carry it down to Egypt. Then Judah said to his brothers, "What profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites and lay and not lay our hands on him, for he is our brother, our own flesh. And his brothers agreed. When some Midianite traders passed by, they drew Joseph out, lifted him out of the pit, and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver. And they took Joseph to Egypt. When Reuben returned to the pit and saw that Joseph was not in the pit, he tore his clothes. He returned to his brothers and said, "The boy is gone, and where can I turn?" Then they took Joseph's robe, slaughtered a goat, and dipped the robe in the blood. They had the ornamented robe taken to their father, and they said, "This we have found. See now whether it is your son's robe or not." He recognized it and said, "It is my son's robe. A wild animal has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces." Then Jacob tore his garments and put sackcloth on his loins and mourned for his son many days. All his sons and all his daughters sought to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted and said, "No, I shall go down to Sheol to my son, mourning." Thus his father bewailed him. Meanwhile, the Midianites had sold him into Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. So can you tell us a little bit, Jonah and Cameron, but what are some observations and gatherings and insights that you gather from this story and why is it meaningful to the work that you do and to your life and your passions?
You know, when we first started talking about this and talking about clothing, this is a passage that I think has a lot of different significant clothing elements, right? We've got the ornamented robe, also called the robe of many colors, coat of many colors. And that's extremely significant. And then we also have, you know, a couple people rending their clothes in mourning, wearing sackcloth. So I thought it was just a really great clothing passage, but it's also a really great queer passage. You know, we're here and it's Pride Month, and obviously Cameron and I are here to kind of represent queer church and queer community. And you mentioned Jonah and the Peacock, which is one of the two podcasts that we put out. And Jonah and the Peacock was the first, and it was really sort of based on my observation that when queer people and trans people and again, people with many marginalized identities are interpreting scripture, we often find a lot more and different meanings than are available to us when it is a select set of privileged voices that interpret the text. And so one of the things that I've always thought was really fascinating about this text is how queer coded it is. There's a lot of queerness in this passage that I think gets easily overlooked by a non-queer audience. And personally, like I remember, I don't know if my mom was just like a really big Donny Osmond fan, but was anybody aware of Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, the Broadway show and whatever? And I grew up in Chicago, and so it came through, and we didn't like go to the theater a lot, but somehow we got tickets to see this show, right? And it's this musical, and so like there's a lot of queerness involved in it anyway, because like theater's just really gay space. And then Donny Osmond is like in this big, beautiful, like fabulous, garment and just like dancing around the stage, being really femme in a lot of ways. And I was like transfixed as a child because like as a non-binary and genderqueer person, I've always been drawn to gender bending and beauty and the expression of gender in ways that are transgressive. And so I memorized every lyric to that entire show. Like I can't read these passages without like hearing like Jacob and Sons, it's all in there for me. And so as a queer person and as a non-binary person, as a gender transgressive person reading this passage, I see so much here that's worth dwelling in. And for me, part of this goes back to actually what comes before it. Jacob and his story of pursuing his own birthright, basically stealing the birthright from his brother. But Jacob, contrasted with his brother Esau, Jacob was also very gender transgressive. Esau was like an outdoorsman and hairy and like masculine and out in like hunting a lot, versus Jacob, who is described by the text as staying at home with his mother more often, softer skin, just sort of like more feminine in a lot of the ways they describe his body and his persona and his behavior. And so there's a lot of queerness already that Jacob brings into the story. And so Jacob is somebody who has been gender transgressive at some level or another. And then he has all of these sons. He has a dozen sons. And his youngest seems to maybe be a little bit more like him, and is consequently his favorite. So Jacob, who has this kind of queer experience of gender bending, connects really deeply with his son Joseph, and sees him and validates him and affirms him. And part of that affirmation is this beautiful garment that is gender transgressive. And it is, there's already, some animosity from the brothers because, oh, you're the favorite, whatever. But especially when that gender bending gets affirmed through the gift of this garment, that's when they really start to lose it. And that's not an uncommon experience for queer kids and families, right? To be bullied, to be outcast for the expression of who they are, including, like in broader culture, but also, in the home. And then the story goes on, right? And we see something that I also think is a very common queer experience, which is that Joseph is divinely gifted. When we kind of zoom out to look at many different cultures throughout history and the ways that we have related to the divine, most cultures that have been able to recognize third genders or more, most cultures that have been able to hold space for queerness and transgressive gender expression have upheld the queer and trans members of their community as divine healers, as shamans, as medicine folk. And so we see that parallel in the story with Joseph. He is a divine prophet. He is a dream interpreter. And so he starts to be divine. He starts to fulfill his divine call. And all of this is just too much. And the kind of cisgender, heteronormative family around him are so threatened by this as to consider killing him and eventually selling him into slavery. And I think after that, again, we get this beautiful garment kind of factoring in again. And there's something so particular about the tearing of that, the smearing it with blood to be the symbol of like this, your child is dead. And again, we get then Jacob, who was so connected to this child of his who shared that experience, tearing his own clothes and saying, I might as well go down to Sheol. I might as well be dead myself. So, just to kind of walk through the story a little bit, those are the things that really shine to me that I hadn't heard really articulated by, cishet interpretations of the scripture. And so I think that all of those elements really stand out as super, super vital to me to understanding this story.
Yes, thank you. That's very powerful elements that, yes, often get missed or overlooked or purposefully hidden from how we look at the text. But I love all the connections that you're drawing to clothing, to both how it's an expression of ourselves, who we are, but also how, and we see this for many queer and trans, there can be an element of danger of to yourself from how society and your family responds to that. So, but it's so meaningful to see that represented in the story in the Bible, as you're saying, Joseph, who's divinely gifted who then becomes a liberator for his people. So yes, Cameron, I want to give you also a chance to speak about your insights or what connections you see in this passage to yourself for the broader queer experience.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just take it, personally that when I read this story, I think of so many of the experiences that I've had, right? It took me a long time to become the exact person that I am. I mentioned growing up in spaces that when I ask questions, it was like, why are you asking these questions? It's very clear in the Bible, stop asking these questions. Or, and then when I finally started to say like, hey, actually, like, not am I just the rebel kid asking all these questions, I'm also like different than you say is okay. And when I started to come out as queer and then as trans, I had many experiences where I've been fired from jobs because I was in Christian jobs. I've been thrown out of churches and said like, you cannot be here. And I think like when I think of this passage, that's what's happening here, right? Like I'm coming out, I'm being like fully alive. I'm fully seeing more of God. I'm seeing more of myself. I'm visioning in this way that says, hey, the church could be different if you would just accept me for who I am. And instead, the easy thing to do is to just like kill that vision. And so I resonate a lot with this story. And I think what's interesting, if you go into some of the spaces that I think of, right? Like I try to be in academia and think of history and like why things happen in systems. And one of the things that pops out also in this story is the fact that, you know, they were like, hey, let's just kill him. Let's kill him and tell dad he's dead and that. And then a brother says, yeah, but what profit is that? How do we actually like make some money off of hurting our brother, right? And I think that unfortunately I see often where when we talk about the most marginalized, the Joseph here, like that's what happens, right? Like we harm the most marginalized for a profit, therefore leaving someone actually in slavery. And so that's something also that I think that this story is calling us to think about and us to examine the church, like Big C Church Christianity, as, you know, people who are making profit off of harming the most marginalized. And we see that here in this story. And I think of, again, some like personal things that are happening today. We see Jacob, you know, ripping his clothes and putting on sackcloth in mourning when we have the loss of a child, which again was for profit. And we can think of things like Texas upholding, you know, legislation saying that we're going to harm parents and call CPS on parents if you care for and love your divine trans child, right? And why are those laws being put into place? Who are the people that are those people are trying to cater to? People probably trying to profit off of the loss and hardships and marginalization of trans youth. And so I think that there's a lot that we can say about this passage that speak exactly to today. So those are some of the things that popped out for me.
Yes. And that's been something that we have talked about in this campaign, about how we can live out justice in very tangible ways, right? And one of those ways is that we see so many times in the Bible, like clothing being torn and you wearing ashes as a way to mourn when injustice is happening and protest that injustice. So yes, I love that this is here present in the passage as well as and how we can connect it back to all of the injustices that LGBTQ and queer people that we're suffering today. So on that note, I wanted to ask about how can churches or faith communities work to become more radically inclusive and to really work to protect the lives and rights of our LGBTQ community and siblings?
Yeah, I think, you know, there are it is hard to become radically inclusive if you aren't willing to like kind of go all in, you know? And I've done a lot of work with a lot of churches who are trying they're trying their hardest to do the right thing, which in my opinion is to be on the side of like the trans kids, right? And I think that it is hard to do when you have groups within a church that say like, well, this group is cool with it, but this group isn't cool with it. And it gets really complicated there. But I think that the best thing that anyone can do is just like, let's talk about what is happening in this world and how it is affecting children. Like, I think that you can see in media, you can see the depiction of Christianity. And if there's ever a story about a queer or trans person in media, they are not Christians, or they have some sort of story about how they're sad that they're not a Christian, right? And so that says something to me that like, hey, Christianity is equaling, homophobia and transphobia. And so I think the first thing that churches need to be doing is literally having that conversation. That is step number one. What are we doing that is harming our youth? And I understand that there are again, I grew up in a place that said, people who are LGBTQ cannot be Christians. So I understand where that is coming from, but let us actually understand where that's coming from. And there's lots of books and there's lots of like history that is showing things about the fact that the word like homosexual wasn't even in the Bible until 1946 and like things like that, right? Let's get real about our history. But really, I think this is a spiritual thing. Like, what is it that is making us want to uphold things that make us uncomfortable? So I think some of that is really important. But the other things is just like, for us, when you say radical inclusion, that again means holding up the most marginalized. And so sometimes that means having to take step backs and saying like, I'm not the most marginalized person here. I want to hear from the voices of those folks, and then do the things. So I think if you want to be a place that is affirming and have people feel safe, you have to be safe people. And I say that because there's a lot of folks who will put up a flag in front of a church and say, come on in, right? And that's a great step. Like, thank you for doing that. And then when people come, we're asking really bad questions of them. We're not actually making sure that the space is safe. We are, like, especially for trans folks, like, I'll just get like bluntly honest, like there's so many people who have asked me about my genitals, right? Like, it's like, hey, don't do that, right? Like, I know that that's like a thing that I feel like I shouldn't have to say, but it happens all the time. And so there are things like that absolutely are in places that say, hey, we're safe people. I know at Zao, for instance, since we're talking about clothing, one of the things that we are doing is setting up a trans clothing boutique, right? Where clothing is so vital to our expressions of who we are and who we say we are to the world. And so when you're a trans person trying to like literally try on who you are, and there are no safe places to do that. There's not dressing rooms for you to do that. There aren't bathrooms for you to do that. There aren't, so we're trying to set up this trans clothing boutique where trans folks can come in and say, hey, anything we have here was donated from the community. We're getting community donations. Come in, have a safe place, have a safe bathroom that's totally gender neutral so that you don't have to choose. Try on anything you want and walk out with anything you want. And I think that that's something that we are currently doing that has been really, really cool and has been received really well. We've had some kind of like clothing swaps and things like that. And hundreds of people are showing up to things like this because so many trans folks are like, hey, this is a safe place to do that. So I'll stop there. Maybe Jonah has some other things to add.
Yes, no, but I love that idea, and I think that really shows how you're being radically inclusive, right? Like, you're listening to people and seeing what is something we can do to actually show up and actually do something. And so you're hearing, clothing is so important. Okay, let's set up this boutique. And so I love that, because it doesn't come from like, oh, I think this is what you need and this is what we should do, but it really is about centering those who've been pushed to the margins and saying, okay, how can we be a church that is for you, and you are speaking into that. So love that idea and the connection to clothing. But Reverend Jonah, I'll also let you speak to that question.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that that we get asked to do a lot is, let me back up. I'm really, really grateful for this opportunity that we've had to come here to talk to you all about clothing and about interpreting the Bible and how to be a community for justice. We have a lot to say on all those kinds of things. And it's really refreshing to be able to start the conversation from the point of scripture, from the point of our gifts for interpretation, from the wisdom that we have gathered doing church planting and building ministry. I think something that really well-intentioned folks do is often ask queer and trans people to put their energy towards helping homophobic or transphobic people process their homophobia and transphobia. And that takes a lot of energy away from us. So like the more conversations that we have to have as queer and trans people, explaining the clobber verses, or like helping people process their feelings about whether or not we're going to hell, or debating whether or not we have a right to be in church, the less energy we have to actually queerly interpret the Bible and build trans clothing boutiques and build churches with queer and trans leadership and show and demonstrate to the church what it means to queer the church. I just want to point folks towards resources that exist and say, like, it's really important that you have more queer and trans voices speaking into your life, speaking into your church, speaking into your ministry, speaking into your interpretation of scripture and theology. And to the extent that you can access resources that exist in books or online, or to do that work, especially that early work, right? The like, how do I cope with this? Is this even right? How do I convince these other people? Like that early work, if you can do that on your own, then you can empower the leaders and voices in your community to actually tell you, for instance, what Jesus means to them, tell you, what their clothing means to them, talk about what it means to oppose the war as a Christian, right? And I think that like a lot of our energy gets sapped in justifying our existence instead of bringing our beautifully unique queer and trans perspective to all the other extremely important stuff that cisgender and heterosexual people get to talk about all the time, because their gender and sexuality is not the like main focus of conversation. So, again, I'm grateful for the ways that we've been able to lead in our community, but like how, I have been invited to explain the anti-queer interpretations of the Bible 10 times as often as I have been invited to talk about literally anything else. And like, if queer people are divine healers, if queer people are divine interpreters, and all we are given to interpret is to challenge the queerphobic and transphobic rhetoric against us, that's just a way of like continuing to ingrain that oppression that sidelines us from leading in the church. So find ways to let your people lead, especially if they're young people, because young queer and trans people have a lot of wisdom to share, and they're already exhausted by the oppression that comes from being marginalized. And so giving them the kind of support, whether it's, respecting their names and pronouns, creating safe and affirming spaces for them, giving them that support so that they can creatively impact the world is going to change the church.
Yes, amen. And yes, that idea of, you are more than just the marginalized identity that society tries to put on you, and you can speak into so much more from your identity, but seen as a three-dimensional person, right? And yes, and that's I hope that part of this conversation will inspire all of you in the call to have those courageous conversations and not always put the burden on other queer or LGBTQ people, right? To look at what they're saying, what are resources that you can look at, look at their podcasts that were mentioned, and then go and have those conversations in your community to be those courageous conversations, so that the church or the communities that you are part of can be ready to let queer and trans and LGBTQ people lead and speak into these other things without having to always be the ones doing the work. So on the topic of clothing and fashion, and that's been one of the main threads of this campaign, right, is how can we use fashion and clothing to really embody our faith, to really embody our justice practices. So how have you personally or in community used fashion and clothing to reclaim the gloriousness of your bodies?
Cameron, were you gonna hop in? Okay.
Sure, I can start. So again, kind of how I mentioned how important it is for trans folks specifically, but I think queering, you know, how things are is also a part of that. So it's so important to kind of like find your thing, right? And I know for me, as I was journeying from being like a fully out kind of trans person, it was so difficult to like find your style and find like, you know, who you are, what looks good on your body, right? And the thing about bodies for me, I know, is like, you know, there were things that I needed to medically do to make sure that I felt awesome in my body so that my clothes also felt awesome on my body, right? And so I think some of that was really important for me, and it's not everyone's experience. I want to be really clear about that, but it was really important for me. And so once I started to kind of to see myself, you know, as my body, like the clothing that like was put on that body was also really important in different times, because depending on what my body looked like, it was depending on what kind of clothing really felt awesome, you know? And now I'm like, woo, this is who I am, and it's really good to be. But things that I have found for me that are really fun as a pastor is wearing graphic tees, right? Like I have, like, I think it's kind of a joke at Zao at this point of like, what t-shirt is Cameron going to wear this Sunday and what does it say? And I think that that's kind of my thing now, where it's not even just the fact that I love the way that now a t-shirt fits on my chest, but then what does that thing say, and how important is it for me to put that forward so that people are reading what those things say too. So you know, we're in Pride Month. We at Zao our Milwaukee has Pride Fest this weekend, and so we have shirts that we always go to Pride Fest with that say this year we have ones that say like, no one is free until we're all free, right? And it's trying to incorporate like, you know, that idea of liberation, where we will be free once like a Black trans woman who has maybe a disability, if she is free, then we all are free, right? Because we're holding up that most marginalized. And so we have shirts like that. We also have shirts that say God is proud of you. And I know that when I walk around like having that on my chest to the world, how many people are like, they stop and they're like, I like your shirt. And I'm like, I like you, you know, like, and it's just that thing where like people, I feel like we all know the queers always find each other, you know, but it's those little things that make you more of a safe person. And it's a message that you get to put out. And as a Jesus follower and a person who believes in the divinity of, you know, all people, including queer and trans folks, that's something that they get to see that is an opposite message then of so much of what they hear Christians saying. And so I think it's not just those two things, but that's what we have this year at Zao for Pride Fest. But I think that, you know, there's just lots of things that I'm constantly putting out on my clothing that make people stop and look and then ask me questions. And I love that piece because I am an evangelical at heart. Like, I want to have those questions. I want to engage with people about how loved they are and how divine they are and how excited to know them, that I have that desire. And so I just love being able to use clothing in that way to create safety, but also to feel awesome for me, that like I always have cool shirts, you know? So that's part of my story anyway.
So just real quickly, I wanted to share, these are the designs that we have for Pride Fest. God is proud of you. It's playing on that word pride. And we have them as stickers as well. And we have a whole series of stickers that try and like communicate who we are. We're additionally selling some tank tops. One says, "Love me like Ruth loved Naomi." And the other says, "Love me like David loved Jonathan," which is a shout out to other queer coded characters in the Bible, and figures that mean a lot to us. And so yeah, for sure, the things that our clothing literally says, I think is really important. You know, part of what you had asked, Paula, is like, what are the practices or you know, in my mind, I always go to like narratives in our community around bodies and clothing. And I'll never forget one of our community members a couple of years ago now, who is a trans person, was processing their transition, which for them included some medical transition, with their mom. And they were saying, you know, if my body is a temple, then I get to choose how to decorate it. And there's something really holy about saying, you know, because a lot of us have been told that our body is a temple. That means we need to like leave it alone, right? We like, it's this idea that the sacred is like not actually intimate, instead of saying like, no, this is my body. This is the most intimate it could possibly be. And so I get to have choices about how I interact with it. One way of honoring my temple is to make it feel like home. And that is everything from medical transition to fashion choices, you know, to social transition. And a lot of people will try things on at Zao, and that's really amazing. Whether that's trying clothing on in the clothing closet or testing out what it feels like to try a new name or new pronouns at church. And that stuff is really powerful. I think that, you know, for some trans folks, medical transition is really important. For other folks like myself, it's either doesn't quite feel right or isn't quite accessible. And for many of us, even those folks who are doing medical transition, one of the first like really meaningful things that we do is start to play with our presentation in the form of like hair and clothes. And it's so, you know, there's a lot of conversation in the community about gender dysphoria, which is the feeling of dis-ease in one's own body because of the gap between one's experience of gender and one's experience of their body or the world's projections on them. But one of the things that trans folks talk about is gender euphoria, which is the opposite. It's the feeling of being at home in one's gender, the feeling of looking in the mirror and recognizing yourself, the euphoria that comes from being from feeling whole. And like clothing can play such an enormous role in that. You know, I know for me, binding has been really important in that. Finding clothes that fit well, finding clothes that are made well. One of the things that's been really hard for me is to find clothing that both fits my body and affirms my gender. That's sort of getting to what Cameron was talking about earlier. And so like when I found a queer woman run gender neutral clothing company called Dapper Boy that basically like makes masculine style clothing for people with my measurements, I like own everything they've made now. I'm wearing a Dapper Boy t-shirt right now. Like I have lots of different layers. And like over the last few years, like I have started to really invest in clothing that is well made for my body and for my gender. And like, it's hard to even describe how different that feels than trying to, as a non-binary person, shop in the women's department or shop in the men's department and feel like physically feel how out of place I am and how out of sync with my clothing I am. And so to put on clothes that fit my body, that fit my gender, is a real divine experience. And it makes my body feel more like a holy temple that I adorn with love and affection, rather than a place that I'm living as like an interloper, that isn't my home and isn't particularly sacred. So that's how gender and clothing kind of play out for me, is it's that like first line of engagement around feeling at home and connected to your body and showing the world who you are and what makes you feel good.
And I think it says too, who has access to these clothes can speak to who do we think is as being divine and being made in the divine, right? And being able to access ornaments to that divine body, right? And so I love that you found those, and please send the links around, so I'll include it in the follow-up email as well to give a shout out to that company. And it is something that we talked about last week in May with workers' rights and labor rights, that we can be advocating to the big design companies, big clothing companies, to have better practices around how they treat their workers. We can also do that around the gender norms that can be so confining and that can be harmful to our LGBTQ community, right? How can we push big labels to make clothes that are accessible to everyone, to queer people, to people with disabilities, to others who are pushed to the margins, and clothes are not made for them by designers. So that's part of the advocacy that we can be doing as well, to what you're speaking. One of the things I wanted to do, but the conversation is just so good, I didn't want to stop, but was to think through how we can be advocating in our communities. I think it was Cameron that mentioned that there's a lot of state laws, like the law in Texas and in Florida, there was just the Don't Say Gay law that passed. And so getting involved locally and figuring out, what laws are being proposed or coming in our states that are harmful to our LGBTQ community, and which ones are helpful, which ones are protecting and defending the rights of LGBTQ people. And then also figuring out what organizations are in your state that you can get involved locally to do that local advocacy, to ensure that, especially as people of faith, we are showing up and showing our support, or opposing these laws that many people will think, Christians are going to be for those harmful laws, and then being that moral voice that says, no, actually, we oppose that law. But there was a question that came in. So thank you so much for sharing your perspective. Love hearing from you. I'm curious if you could speak to your experience with clergy or liturgical vestments as queer pastors. Are there pieces of or styles of clothing that translate to sacred, holy attire in queer spaces?
This is one of the most just acknowledged things among queer pastors, that vestments are just really gay. But they always have been. One of my friends, Ian, talks about the queeniness of clerical wear, that historically it's always been, it's usually been men or male assigned people wearing these very elaborate, beautifully ornate robes and dresses. So Ian talks about how he got into the church because he really liked the sort of queenie performance of it all, that it was just this very beautiful kind of feminine space in that way for him. And so it's hard because I think one of the things that becomes a challenge for us is that, partly due to our just sort of cultural context and personalities, but also because of our position as prominently queer and trans clergy, we kind of disengage from some of the some of the most recognizable symbolism of church hierarchy and authority. which includes a lot of that clerical wear. So, we will wear, the black shirt with the clerical collar. But that's really about it. Now, one thing that I will kind of shout out as like just a tension for me is that I am not allowed to wear a stole. So the stole that is supposed to represent the towel of the servant thrown over the neck is only for ordained people. And because my denomination is still in the midst of an extremely contentious battle about whether queer people have a right to be ordained, I am excusing myself from being fodder in that war. And I only pursued the qualifications that would allow me to lead this church. So I'm a local licensed pastor. I'm like qualified and licensed to lead this congregation, but I'm not pursuing the type of affirmation from my institution that would allow me to wear a bunch of those vestments. And so that's something that's difficult too. So like, how do we signal our holy divine attire when the things that are offered by the church are also gate kept in that same way? And I think some of the answer is we transgress. We wear stuff that is transgressive, and that is what qualifies us as divine leaders in queer space. And so I think that you look to kind of some of these more gender bending figures that are like playing with gender and gendered attire. Those are the things, I debate every year whether to wear a clerical collar to Pride Fest. And this year I'm not even wearing a clerical collar because I will be more recognizable for who I am in sort of street clothes. So I don't know, Cameron, if you have anything more to add to that, but that's kind of my mix of tensions around clerical vestments.
I don't really, other than, again, depending on the community, it sometimes feels like a barrier for folks to really engage in if we are in kind of all that attire. And so I personally love being able to be recognized for who I am. I think my Blackness also has some things to do with that of how I put myself out into the world in that way. You will almost always see me in a hat, and yes, it is some to cover up the fact that I'm losing all my hair, but otherwise, I'm in a hat. I'm always, I have bracelets that are saying like trans is beautiful, and all those kind of things that put me out there. And then people find out I'm a pastor, right? And I think that that's important because again, some of those things can become barriers, and we don't want them to be.
Yes, for sure. And definitely sensing that tension and those decisions that we make, which is, it's, those are intentional, and we're constantly having conversations about that. And, but yes, it's something to lament, right? That so many churches are still having this debate, and so you're barred from certain things because of your identity. So that's definitely something to lament and something to keep working at, making the church a more safe and inclusive space, and a space where everybody can be themselves and be able to use those divine gifts that we were talking about with the story of Joseph.
Real quick, one more anecdote to add to people's understanding of what that means in a practical sense. Oftentimes very often when I wear my clerical collar in public, someone will imply to me that it will become clear that someone thinks that I'm wearing a costume. Because they don't think, for any number of reasons, that someone like me could ever be wearing that in a way that's recognizable by church authority. And that's people who would hate me and people who would love me. All of them find this sort of find it incompatible, right? So that's just something to know too, that sometimes even the things that we hold sacred have become so out of alignment with what God is doing in the world that it's actually creates cognitive dissonance to try and fit them together.
Thank you both so much for giving time out of your very busy Pride Month and Pride Fest coming up. So we truly, truly appreciate it. We know that this time is gold. So thank you for that and for sharing. And God bless all that you do, all your ministry, all of the work that you do for justice in your community as well.
Thanks for watching one of the 7 episodes of Clothed in Glory. And don't forget to subscribe to support SojoAction's work and see more content like this.